Welcome back to this series where we're covering the content required for the AWS Cloud Practitioner certification. Now, as promised, in this video we're going to cover the physical infrastructure of AWS that makes all the magic happen. Even though it feels like knowledge you shouldn't need as an AWS cloud developer, it is something the exam requires. So with that said, jumping straight into it, AWS resources are hosted in multiple locations worldwide called regions, and each region consists of 3 or more availability zones. And each availability zone consists of 1 or more data centers. Now, most availability zones have multiple data centers, so this layering creates redundancy. So if something were to happen to one data center, there would be other data centers to keep it backed up. And if something were to happen to an entire availability zone, there would be a different availability zone to keep it backed up. So in this way, things hosted on AWS are really available, meaning if something does go wrong, there's usually a backup that's ready to take over. Now, going back to regions, there can be multiple regions in one country, and each region is made to be independent and private of all other regions. In practice, this means the regions aren't sharing data with each other, so it builds fault tolerance, in that if something goes wrong in one region, it doesn't affect any of the others. And by default, everything in a region is private, so it's not open to the internet and the public. So every time you're building something in AWS, you have to specifically configure it to be open to the internet. And that way you're not creating access points for hackers to get into your system, because by default, everything is private. And when you view your resources in the AWS console, you're only going to see the resources tied to the region specified. Since each region is isolated, the dashboard can't combine your resources from different regions. Moving on to availability zones now. Most availability zones have many data centers, so if something were to break in one of the data centers, then the instances running on it would immediately be shifted to a different data center. So ultimately, your app's going to continue running just fine. To your end user, they might not even notice anything. Again, this is just another way AWS is making its services highly available. And as for how the locations of regions and availability zones are decided, Amazon only opens regions and availability zones in countries that are politically stable and where they can get agreements and guarantees from the government. So again, there's no chance of geopolitical tensions messing up AWS. And at this point, it feels like AWS's security is more well thought out than most militaries. But that's not all. So the availability zones in one region are never all exposed to the same risk. So if there was an availability zone that was close to a fault line where earthquakes are likely, then there would be a backup AZ somewhere else that won't be exposed to the same risk. And yes, I am going to start calling them AZs because availability zone is getting tiresome. Now, within AWS, there is something called CloudFront. CloudFront is a series of something called edge locations which store static data to deliver it to users faster. For example, if you had a content website that was delivering videos to users, then CloudFront would cache that data, and then once the user requested that data by trying to view the video, it would be delivered by the CloudFront edge location that was closest to them. So the performance would be much faster. In practice, this means the video would lag less. So for the exam, you need to know that CloudFront is the service that manages all of the caching locations that provide static content to end users. The caching locations are called edge locations, so this is an entirely different structure that's within the AWS ecosystem, so to speak. Now, related, there's this thing called AWS Outpost. Now, an outpost is a hardware rack that Amazon can install on premises for you. And this would be completely managed and configured by Amazon, so you won't be able to access the physical hardware. But if you were a business that trusted your own security more than AWS, then this might be a viable solution. So you could still use AWS, but have your most confidential information on site. This might also be relevant if you're trying to meet government regulations to do with confidential user data. Now, one final thing I'm going to mention is how you interact with all of this AWS stuff. So there are 3 separate ways you can interact with it. The first and easiest is called the AWS console, which you log in with a username and password. It looks something like this, and through here you can access all of AWS's services. Now, another way is using AWS command line interface, so using terminal commands to access and configure your AWS environments. And the final way is using AWS's SDK, meaning the software development kit. So this means interacting with AWS directly through your code. That's all for this one. Next video, we're talking about storage in AWS. See you then.